So while people might still arrive, let me just get going here. So you should know the drill by now. I should actually ask someone else to do it. So we're going to make a folder, and then I'm going to make my index file in there, and then the terminal window, and that should, yes, so we're happy with all of the answers, yes. The advantage of doing this so many times is that you will not forget that easily afterwards. Dev, and we used Nodemon. If I could type, that would actually be much easier. So there, and then I need to let some people in. And then let's install Nodemon. So that would be npm install Nodemon, and then remember the special magical incantation save dev. There we go. And would that be all? I think so. So npm run dev. And of course, I don't have anything in here. So when I put something in there, then it is written out. Thank you, Jan. I will pass it along. Okay. So if any of you have any questions, then just interrupt as always. I had an example to start with the next bit. So last time we talked about operators and so on. We talked about if-else statements. I created an example, but I actually think it makes more sense to use the stuff I had for the homework as well. So what I did for the homework was I said, you have a temperature. So I'm just going to repeat a very small part of that. You have a temperature, and that was an object. Remember the terminology. And that object had two properties, a value. I shouldn't use commas in my numbers. And a, I didn't call it type, I called it unit, which makes more sense, like that. And then I told you, well, depending on which unit you have, whether it's Kelvin or Fahrenheit or Celsius, I want code that will always write it out as degrees Celsius. And let me see if I can get some more light in here as well. That would be cool. So I always want Celsius, and then you have to use if-else statements to convert the temperature. And if you've tried that, then you should have seen, especially once you start also looking at the error handling that I had in there, so the additional questions, that the code can become a little bit convoluted, meaning not so legible anymore. And that is because once you have if-else statements that kind of get nested, it can become difficult, and especially when you have Boolean conditions in those ifs that consist of multiple parts, then the legibility goes downhill quite fast. And there is a construct in JavaScript that does a little bit of a better job, and I wanted to show that before we move on to loops. And that a construct is called switch. It's nothing to do with InFocus in this case. And a switch statement roughly consists of what I'm going to write here. I'm just going to put some stuff here. And at the top, you have the value that you want to examine and do something with. And each of these cases will do a comparison with that value. And in case the comparison gives true, then the code in between these curly brackets will be executed. Yeah? To make it specific, if I say I'm interested in temperature.units, so in our example, that would give me K. And for the case, I'm going to say, you have to get used to the way this is written, but once you're used to it, it is not that difficult. So basically, after switch, you have the value that you're interested in, and each case statement that you have is going to compare that value that is in here to what you write after a case. And if that is true, it is going to execute what I have following that. So if I want to do this for, which would make sense, I'm going to be the lazy developer and copy paste this. If I know that I can have K, F, and C, KFC, that was not intentional. That's the first time I noticed that about temperature scales. Anyway, when you know that it can be Kelvin, Fahrenheit, or Celsius, I can have case statements for each of these things. And the idea is, of course, that then in here, you do the conversion that you want to do. So I could say converted temperature, just define that. And then under Kelvin, I can say converted temperature is no, hold on, temperature dot value minus, and it is 273.16. Yeah, so again, look at the value of temperature.unit, compare it to the case statements, and JavaScript is going to select the one that matches. In our case, it would match with this one because unit is K. And then it will execute what comes after that case. Now, there are two additional things you have to know about case, and one is really, really iffy and easy to forget. So you have to be very careful about that. And what you need to know is that it will start at K, but it will just keep going. So if I have other stuff here, if I also add what I have for converted temperature is, let me see if I can do this by heart, value, it's Fahrenheit, so minus 32 to compensate, and then divide by 9 times 5. Yeah. So if I write it like this, it is going to start at the K option. It is going to do this calculation, but then it's simply going to keep going until it does all the statements in this switch statement. And that is, of course, not what we want. What we want is we want to run the code in here, in between these curly brackets, and then we want to stop. And you can do that by adding a break statement. Yeah. So it's going to jump to this one because that is where it matches. It's going to run all the code in these curly brackets here. It's going to start there and going to do our conversion. And then the break is a jump to the line after the switch. So it will just stop that statement that we have here, and it will continue after the switch. And we could say console log converted temperature. And then when we run this, the temperature I get is 25 because I thought about it. So yeah, there's a couple of other things that are now not completely correct. So first of all, I would have to have a break statement here and there. So normally when I use this kind of switch statement, I will start by making the cases, and I will start by adding a break in each of my cases, so I'm sure that I don't forget it and well, get results that I don't want. Yeah. The other thing that you should know is that there is also a default option. And for default, I don't add anything. And as you can imagine, it just means if none of the other cases is going to catch it, then it's going to go here. So I could do a console log that says, I don't know this option. Yeah. I hope that makes sense. Yes.
David, I just have a question. When not using switch case, and you have like what you ask in the homework, having like capitals and lower cases, then you can use a pipe. Can you use a pipe also in the case, or you have to make a specific case?
Yeah, you have to make a case, but it's actually, and that is one of the advantages. You can do it in a more legible way. So what I can do is I can say case K, and then maybe also even case Kelvin. Yeah. So instead of making it a condition with Boolean logic in it and so on, I can just have multiple case statements. And as soon as it is K or K, small case or Kelvin, it is always going to execute this code now. And of course, I can do the same thing for here. I have to do it properly. So I can add it there as well.
Everything that is before the curly brackets will be used as being the same case, let's say, and then you will execute what is between the brackets, the brackets. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So that is why I was saying this is more, to me, this is more elegant and more legible perhaps than what you could do with multiple if then else statements, because at least here you get a list. And when you add comments, you can properly label each of the conditions, and in the end, you're going to end up with something that is easier to understand afterwards. Yeah. So it's a really nice statement. Just make sure that you get the syntax correct, and that you have all the bits in the right location, and make sure that you add this break. Forgetting to add that can be a really annoying bug. In fact, if you're scared that you're not going to remember the syntax and so on, you shouldn't care about that. Go online, use Google, say switch JavaScript statement, and you're going to get perfect examples of how to do it. The other thing you can do, and I don't think I have installed one, but if you look at the extensions for Visual Studio Code, there are extensions that contain snippets and so on, and let you add, well, then you could write JavaScript switch, and it would expand that to a complete template that you can then fill up. So there are ways to deal with that. Remembering grammatics or the way to write things in a language has nothing to do with development. Yeah, so if you find it difficult to remember that, just look it up online. That there's no shame in that whatsoever. So there is one thing now that is a little bit annoying, at least when and this is also goes back a little bit to homework as well. But what I'm doing here is I have a case for the C, and then what I would need to do is I would just need to say converted temperature equals temperature value. Yeah. If it's C, I don't need to convert it. It's already there. This is something that you will see when you start writing code quite a bit as well. And what I prefer to do, instead of declaring this variable here and then, so what I would prefer to do, I think in this case, is already assigning something there. And what you're doing in that case is, and usually I would add comments to that as well. Assume we have Celsius, for example. When we have Celsius, it's correct what I've done here. Yeah, and then I don't have to do it. I don't have to do it there. So in many of these constructs, when you do if then else and so on, you can start by filling in, making an assumption in one direction, and then just writing the code for that. And then your if or your switch only has to deal with the cases if it's not equal to K. And then I could even, if I know it has to be Kelvin, Fahrenheit, or Celsius, I can delete that because I don't need it anymore. I know that if it's not caught by these, then it has to be Celsius, and so, yeah. And if I'm really sure of that, and I don't want to do error handling, then I can delete that one as well, and it will still work as expected. But be careful. If I now say this is A, it's going to be interpreted as it was Celsius. Yeah? I'm assuming it's Celsius here, and none of these cases will catch my A value. So it is going to assume it was Celsius, and it's not going to do any conversion. So we're kind of skimping on error handling when I start removing the default case and so on. Be aware that you're doing that. It's not bad necessarily, just you have to be aware of error handling. And I think I've said it before, I'll say it again, error handling usually takes more time than all the rest of your code together. Does that make sense? Any questions? Good. So let me move on. I'm going to just comment this out so that we don't see the output of that anymore at the bottom. You can leave it there, it's not a problem. So let's move on with the next bits. We have two concepts left to cover the basics, I think. One is loops and the other is functions. And once you've seen these two, we can start doing interesting things, because then you've seen all of the basic syntax, I think. So let's retake one of the examples we had. I will create an array. An array you create by having brackets, and then I can have animals in there. I don't know why I like the aardvark, but I like it. We want another one, maybe. So just an array, 4 animals in there, nothing special. Now, the question is, and how we get to loops, is how do you write out all the stuff in there? Of course, I can say console log animals and just do that, and that will write out the complete array, but that might not always be what I want. What if I want to write out animal with index 0 is penguin, animal with index 1 is arc, and so on and so on. I can't do it this way. I could, of course, do that by referencing them one by one. And I could say animals 0 and then animals 1 and then and so on. You understand that this is not what a developer likes. It's way too much typing, and if I have 1,000 elements in my array, I probably don't want to do it one by one. So we need something that runs over the array, and that is a loop. And the first type of loop I'm going to show you is it's probably the most common loop in well, most scripts that I've written, that I've seen, is a for loop. And the for loop starts with a keyword. The keyword is for, and then it has parentheses and then curly brackets, same as our switch statement before. But the way we're going to fill this in is a little bit different. And I will write that, and then I will explain what it does. So what I'm going to do is declare a variable index. I'm going to initialize it to 0. And then I'm going to end that statement and add a second statement. And there I'm going to compare this index that I just created to animals length. Remember that length is a property of an array and it returns the number of elements in the array. I'm going to end that statement again, and then I'm going to say index plus plus. Now, what is all of this crap? Well, you need all of it. This first statement is going to be run before the first time your array does anything. Yeah, so that's the initialization part, if you want. And what I do in the initialization part is I say, well, when I run this loop, I want to have a variable. And I could have defined the variable before, but I'm going to define it inline in my loop. That is usually the way it is done. And I'm going to initialize it at 0 because I want to start at the first element of my array and I want to run through all of them. So this index is 0. So remember, this is the initialization part of the loop. This is the termination part of the loop. This is the part that determines whether the code between the curly brackets that you have here is going to be run. And so what I'm saying is you have to run the code if the current value of index is smaller than animals.length. So as long as we have an index that is still in our array, I want to run the loop again. And then this bit is going to be run after each go through the loop. So it's not run at the beginning. It is only run at the end of the loop. And then after that, the termination statement is tried again. So if you want to see an order of things, it's going to be let index be equal to 0. Is index smaller than animals.length? Animals.length is 4. So is it smaller? Yes. That will mean that the loop is going to run. Index plus plus. So when we get here, index is now 1. It goes back to here. The termination statement is tested. 1 smaller than 4, yes. So it's going to run the loop again. At the end, it's going to do index plus plus. So now we have 2, and so on and so on. And it's going to continue to do that until we end up with index 4, and then it will say 4 smaller than 4, no. So then it's false and the loop will stop. What do we put in there? Well, whatever code you want. So I could do console log animals index. And when I save that, you can see what happens at the bottom, penguin, and so on and so on. So all 4 animals are written to the console. Why? Well, because I start at 0, and then I write out element 0, then it is increased in value, I write out the next one, and so on and so on. The difficult part about for loops, and it's easy in this case because it's a small example, but the difficult part for loops is to figure out what the termination statement needs to be. Yeah? And whether this needs to be smaller than, or does it need to be smaller than or equal, for example. Yeah, so you have to think a little bit about the border conditions of your loop, but that is something that you get used to. What would happen if I get it wrong? Well, then my loop is going to be called 5 times in total, and the last time it will ask for animals index 4. There is no animals index 4. This is 0, this is 3. And what we saw was that asking for an element in an array past the end of the array, well, what you get back is undefined. So in this case, it's not too bad what happens. It just writes out undefined, but of course, that's not what you want. You want it to neatly run over the array. And of course, I only have one statement here. I can have as many statements here as I want. So I could say, I could also write out my, my index, and then it's going to say 0 and so on. So this is a for loop. And like I said, probably the most common complex statement that that you see in scripts. When you want to loop over an array, or when you simply want to do something 10 times, then this is the way to do it. Everything of this can be modified. So I could say I want to start at 1 instead. There's no problem with that. It is just going to start at 1, and it's not going to write out one element here. Yeah? So no problem. Or I could say, and you don't see these things very often, I'm going to add 2 each time I go through this loop. Well, then you only have element 0 and element 2 that is written out. So each of these things can be modified. They stand by themselves. The only thing you have to remember is when they are called. This at the beginning of the loop, before anything else, every time we start running through the loop, this index value is checked, or this condition is checked. And when the condition returns false, then the loop isn't done anymore. And this is done at the end. You can think of that as being executed here just before we go back to see whether we need to go another round. What happens when I do this? Anyone wants to make a guess? No? It's a bit of a
I think nothing, since the index is out of the for loop.
Thank you, Jan. Yes. Yeah, so what I said last time, I believe, is that once you start playing with these curly brackets, the variables that you define inside of these things are constrained to those lines. So index exists here because, well, index basically exists here because I have defined it in my loop itself. So I can use it inside of the loop, but once I get here, it doesn't exist anymore. And that's why I get a crash when I try to do that. And it says index is not defined. Yeah. So just keep that in mind. Now you could potentially work around that if you wanted to. I could say, I could do this. And that would work as well. So now I define the value of index before my loop and I use it inside my loop. And now it is still going to exist here. And when I say console log, I should see that it writes out 4. Because it went through, the last time it went through, the value was 4. This condition failed, so it doesn't execute it again. And the value of index is 4. But in general, this is a bad idea. I would not do this. I always define these things here. What you will see very often in code is, if it's not my code anyway, is that people will use things like I or X or J for, you can do that. It is totally up to you. I don't like that. Because it makes the code harder to read, I think, but that's a matter of taste.
You could also, I mean, inside of the loop, you might calculate values for a new variable. So you have to define that one at the start outside, and then so you can use it afterwards.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So everything that you define in here, so if I would say, final result, I don't know why we would do this, but if I would say final result is, okay, again, if I define it here inside of my loop, I can't use it there. So if I want to do something like that with calculations and stuff, I need to move that to in front of my loop, and then I can set values to it in my loop. Yeah. So everything, what happens in a loop, loops are like Vegas. What happens in a loop stays in a loop. There is a fixed border around it at in both locations. Okay, so given that I'm a developer and that by definition that means I'm lazy, this is a lot of work if I only want to write out each animal in turn. Yeah. So in many cases, sometimes you need the index value. You need to know where you are in the array. Sometimes you don't. And actually here I don't. If I go back to my original example where the only thing I write out is the animals, I don't need this index. I just need to define it and all this other stuff in order to run through my loop. So let me show you how you can do this in ES6 JavaScript. This is modern JavaScript. Don't do it in Switch. So I can again define a for loop. But now, instead of defining an index, I'm going to say this. That and there. I'll type it first and then I'll explain. There. That does exactly the same thing. Yeah? But you can see that the syntax is kind of more concise and in a way it's more legible. And what I'm saying here is essentially the same thing happens. I'm just asking JavaScript to do it for me behind the scenes. So what I'm saying is it's a for loop and I'm going to define a variable and I'm going to ask JavaScript to one by one in this animal variable, put all the animals in my loop. So it's going to loop over my array and each time it goes through, it's going to feed the next element into my loop. And then I can use that because it was defined as a variable. No index, no nothing, and it does exactly the same as before. I have to admit that I don't use this very much. And the reason I don't use it very much is because this is new syntax. I wasn't used to writing it. And every time I write a loop, by the time I remember that there is also a shorthand way of doing it, I usually have written this way already. But it can be a nicer way of writing it. The downside is that you don't have the index. Yeah. So these two things are, at least for our example, functionally the same. This you will probably see more in existing scripts and it will work in Switch. This will not work in Switch because it's ES6 based. Okay, now I talked about error handling. What happens when I test some border cases? So what happens when this array that I have here, this animals array, what happens when that's the empty array? Well, nothing happens. And if you go through the code, you'll see why. I'm initializing index to 0, and then I'm saying 0 smaller than animals.length. Animals.length is 0. Is 0 smaller than 0? No, it's equal. It's not smaller than. So it's not even going to execute this loop once. So doing this with an empty array is perfectly safe. There is no problem. That also means you don't have to test for it. Yeah? And that is kind of important. In general, the more code you write, the more mistakes you can make. Yeah? So if you feel that maybe I need to test whether this array is empty or not, and then no, you don't have to. If it's just a matter of not wanting to do anything if the arrow is empty, then you don't have to do anything. This loop code will deal with it perfectly fine. This one as well. It will just not run your loop, not even once. What happens if I forget to define my animals array? Like this. Yeah, if I don't define it, then it would be undefined. Now I'm in trouble. That's not going to work. Why is it not going to work? Well, because I have animals.length here. Animals is now undefined. Length, the property of an undefined thing, that is not possible. And that's exactly the error that you get. Cannot read property length of undefined. So that doesn't work. Does it work in the second type of loop? No, but I get a different error. And it's slightly less clear. It says animals is not iterable. This type of loop requires a variable that is iterable. That is a definition, something, a concept in JavaScript. Something that is iterable means it has different parts and I can look at one part at a time. Animals is undefined. Undefined is not iterable, so I get an error. Yeah? So that error handling you still have to do. Empty arrays, not a problem, but your array has to exist. If it doesn't exist, then you're going to be in trouble. Yeah? How would you do the error handling in this case? Well, you could say something like if animals, and then have the, I will put both of them in there, and now it's protected. I define an animals array, and I say if animals, and that basically means as long as it has something. So if animals is undefined, if animals is null, if it's an empty string, all of these things are going to fail this condition, and then my loops aren't going to be executed. If animals contain something, then like an array, then there is no problem and it's going to run through them. Okay, so that's a for loop. There is one other one that I'm going to show you. There are a few that I'm going to skip because, well, I'm using myself as standard. And if I don't use them, I'm not going to teach them because it probably means that there is another way of doing it. That doesn't mean that you can't use them, but so let's say that we have a heater, not that we need heating today. And we have a target temperature, and our target temperature is 25. And I'm going to comment this one out so that we can focus on what's going on here. So we have a target temperature of 25, and I also have a variable for the temperature, and that is 18. Now, can I make a loop that would do something as long as the temperature variable is not equal to my target temperature? Yes, you could potentially do it with a for loop, but it's not that well suited for that. There is a better construct in JavaScript, and that is a while loop. And the while loop starts with a condition. And so in this case, my condition would be temperature smaller than the target temperature. And then I could say I want to do something in that case, console log. And I want to probably write out temperature. If you click save on this, you're hosed, because when it runs this, you're going to create a beautiful eternal loop. This is an infinite loop. Why? I have a comparison between temperature and target temperature, and I write out my temperature. I actually never modify temperature, so this condition can never be true. So if I want to do something that is reasonable, I could say temperature plus plus. When I do it now, you can see what happens. So temperature is 18. Is temperature smaller than target temperature? In other words, is 18 smaller than 25? Yes. So it's going to run my loop, console log, and it writes out 18. And then it increases it to 19, and it tries again. 19 smaller than 25? Yes. So 19. And it makes it 20, and so on until we reach the point where it is 24. 24 smaller than yes, and it still writes out 24. Then it increases it to 25. 25 smaller, no, and the loop stops. So you write out 18 to 24. What is the difficult bit again? Again, this is an easy example, but what is the difficult bit? The difficult bit would be what is the first value that is going to be written out and what is the last value. It's always the boundary conditions that give you headaches. Yeah. So how many times is this loop going to go? At some point, I posted something that was scribbled on a Post-it note on Facebook, I think. And it's a very common occurrence because you have to figure out how many times is this going to be done. If I want it to be done 10 times, what do I need to have as a condition? Does it need to be equal then as well? Or so again, in loops, the difficulty is always to figure out what the start condition is and what the end condition is. And you have to be a little bit careful of that. But this loop is instead of, so this is the for would be mostly used to run over arrays or do something multiple times. When you don't know how many times it is going to be done and you have a condition, then typically the while loop is going to be used. Now, don't be mistaken, my example that I had here for these animals, I can write that with a while loop. And if I think about it long enough, I can write this as a for loop. Yeah? So there is no universal one way to get it correct. Just make sure that you choose something that, well, is logical. Any questions about loops? That's it for that part, I think. If you look at the, and you don't have to be afraid of doing that, if you look at documentation for JavaScript online, you will see that there are other loop constructs that exist. Feel free to use them if they feel comfortable for you. There is no problem with that, but I think if you know these things, you already know quite a bit. So, and then the last concept, if you want, in the basic JavaScript, and probably the most important one in all of this, is the concept of a function. And the reason functions exist, we've already used some, like console log is a function, I've told you that. The reason functions exist is because otherwise, if I would talk about, for example, this here, conversion of temperature, if I have to convert 3 different temperatures in my code, I don't want to copy paste this. You never want to copy paste something and then not modify it afterwards. If you do that, then you have the same code in multiple places. And if I discover that my value for Kelvin was wrong, I will have to go hunt and fix it in multiple places. Yeah. Instead, what you want to do is you want to try and reuse that code, and functions are invented for that. And they're quite simple, and we'll introduce them bit by bit. They start with a reserved word function, and they have a name. And after the name, I have parentheses, and then I have curly braces. What I said about grammar last time, I think, is that things keep coming back. My switch statement had parentheses and then curly brackets. Same here for if, actually. Same for, same for while. So it shouldn't surprise you that it's the same for functions. These things keep coming back. So don't think that you have to learn all that much. My function is very simple. My function creates a nice penguin on the console. There. What happens when I save this and this code is run? Nothing happens. Yeah. So functions are not very useful, apparently. Why doesn't anything happen? Well, what I've done is, same as with a variable, I have declared the function. I have defined it. I have not used it. I've only specified that I want the function, that it is called generate penguin, and that what it does is these statements between the curly brackets. Okay? But because I haven't used it, nothing happens. Actually, functions are something very special in JavaScript, but they resemble variables in many ways. They have a name, and when I say type of, I can do that for a function as well. Yeah. When I say type of and then the name of a function, what I get is function. So what you've defined here, if you want to read it that way, is you've defined a variable of type function and you've called it generate penguin. It's a bit weird, but when we start talking about ES6, there are still enough people who want to do that, then you'll see that this is an essential part of what you need to know to understand what's going on with things like promises and so on. So we've defined it, and as I said, that's not very useful, but now we can use it. I can say generate penguin, and when I do that, I can now get my processing. Yeah. So I defined the fact that it has to write something out on the console, and it writes it out on the console. It's not very exciting. But it means that if I now have a longer script, I have hundreds of lines, that I only have to write this once. And then whenever I want to give someone a penguin in these other 200 lines of script, I can just say generate penguin. That has two advantages. The first one is I don't have to remember what this does. Yeah? I've put it in a function, I can just call it by name and that's it. Second advantage is if I make a mistake here, then I can fix it in one place, and every time I use it will automatically do the right thing now. So in general, if you think, oh, I need to do the same thing here as what I'm doing in some other location, that should ring a bell in your head that says, maybe I need to put that into a function. The technical term for that is refactoring. It is looking at your code and deciding that there is a better way of doing it. And instead of just continuing to copy, paste, and add code, think about what can I do to make it simpler and reduce the number of lines of code I have. Okay, so this is very useful, but what if we want 2 penguins? Well, I'm assuming that I can do this. And if I want 4, I can do it 4 times. Yeah. Does that work? Well, of course it works, but is it what we want to do? Probably not. Yeah. How can we fix that? Well, there are 2 things you could think of. First of all, we've just seen loops, yeah, and when you've just learned how to use a hammer, then everything is a nail, so we could use a loop to do it. But maybe it's more practical if we could make this function smarter. Yeah? And if I know that sometimes I want to write out 1 penguin and sometimes 4 and sometimes 17, then why don't we put that intelligence in here instead? That probably makes more sense. And I'll use the same example as, well, actually, I'm just going to extend this one for now. And then we'll get back to the example afterwards. So how do I do that? We've already seen last time when we talked about push and pop for arrays, for example, you've already seen that there is a possibility for a function to have parameters. So I can have something here. And there is also a possibility for a function to have a return value. And those 2 things can be used to make our function smarter. And looking at the time, I'm going to do it in one go. So let's define a nice function for us. And we're going to call this convert to Celsius. Yeah. And then we're going to give that a temperature, yes. Well, I'm sorry. I'm a developer, so I'm allowed to change my mind and do something that is more logical. Convert from Fahrenheit, let's do that. And we'll give it a temperature. And I'm going to assume that the temperature is in Fahrenheit because my function is called convert from Fahrenheit. And because I am, because I'm a scientist, of course, I'm converting to Celsius. That makes sense. That's the standard unit. So that's what we have to do. Yeah, so what is the only difference that we have here? The difference is that my penguin function had just a name and then an empty list of parameters. My conversion function has a name and one variable in there. You can have as many variables as you want. Yeah? But this one only has one, the temperature that I want to have converted. This is like a variable definition. And what that means is that inside of my function, I can use temperature the same way as if I would have defined it in my function body itself. So I could say something like, let result is, still remember it, temperature minus 32 divided by 9 times 5. It should be correct. It should get smaller. So yeah. So the way I use temperature is exactly the same as if it was a regular variable that was defined somewhere. And I'm using it now to define my or calculate my result. And how do I pass that out to the outside world? Well, I'm going to say return result. And now we're using both concepts. We're using an input parameter, the temperature. I'm doing a calculation with that, and I'm returning the result to the outside world. Whether you write it like this, or you write it like this, is up to you. Yeah, that's exactly the same thing. For a small function like this, this is perfectly legible. There is no real problem with it. I have a tendency of, at the beginning of functions, define a result, and at the end of my function, return that result. That is something, if you would look at my code, it is something that you're going to see come back over and over. Why? Because it's predictable. Yeah? And then if I want to add multiple lines in between, I can do that without having to rework things too much. So I would probably write it like this, but the two things will do exactly the same. Now, how do I use it? For example, so log converts, and how much is 75? That would be 23.8 Celsius. Yeah. The two concepts together, the 75 is the input parameter for my function. So that is what JavaScript will assign to temperature when it calls it. And then the result that is returned comes back out, and in this case is used by console log, but I could just do that here as well. So converted temperature, have I used that somewhere? Oh, converted temperature equals, and then I take this thing and no, yes. So that's exactly the same thing. Yeah, I take the return from that function and I assign it to a variable, and then I write out the variable afterwards. So whether you write things on one line, like here and here, or on 2 lines, is up to personal taste, if you want. There is no functional difference. One might, for you, be a little bit easier to use than the other, but there is no functional difference. Just to make that point, I could, of course, say, I could define my function differently and say convert to Celsius. And then we still take temperature. And now let me steal this bit here. Yeah, so I have I'll put some spacing around it so that we can see what's going on. And then let me save it. Yeah, so much for my spacing. So I have my function. What comes in is temperature. Then I do some calculations here. I will also need the bits here. You'll see in a second. And when my switch is done, I say return and then converted temperature. Yeah, and now we have taken the code that we had for this, this temperature class from the homework from last time, and we've made a function that accepts that as input values or as input value. It does calculations with it and it returns the converted temperature. Of course, now I would have to call it differently. I would have to say result equals convert to Celsius. And what does this expect? Well, it expects this type of object that we had. So let us take the object there. And I can feed that in there. And if we didn't do anything wrong, it writes out the result value. And we have done something wrong. Well, no, I've written out the wrong thing there. It says 25. Yeah. So you can use these functions to encapsulate a difficult bit of code, which means you only have to write it once. And if you're smart, then you remember that you've written it. And the next time you have a project or you have a customer that asks something, you go like, oh, but I've worked with temperatures before. And then you can just reuse that bit that you have. The JavaScript environment within the old version of Switch, for example, does not have the capability of using modules or libraries. The Node.js environment that we're using here does have that capability. So you could even put all of these functions that you write yourself into a module so that you can use it as a library and then reuse it for individual projects. This also shows, and you should realize that, so when you look at this example and you look at this example, this also shows, again, how weakly typed JavaScript is. I just define a parameter here that is called temperature. I expect this to be a number. This function also has an input variable that is called temperature. But here I expect it to be an object, and I expect that object to have a value property and a unit property. Yeah? If you mix these two things, bad things will happen. If I say convert to Celsius and I call that with a number, bad things are going to happen. Why? Because this function expects an object with specific properties. But JavaScript doesn't care about any of that. I don't have to tell what type of variable this is. Yeah? And you can even say it, see it here in a way. It says this is a parameter, temperature is the name, and the possible values are any. Yeah. So I don't have to say what this is. And I could make a function that deals with single numbers correctly and deals with objects correctly and so on and so on. So I can make this function as intelligent as I want. JavaScript does not force me to declare the type of the input parameters that we have. Yeah. I think you're right, Christian. I think it's Celsius and not Celsius. But anyway, it's the same temperature. It's still hot.
I thought you were a physicist, so I'm sorry.
Yeah, yeah. I can't write physicist either in English. So. Seriously. I'm so used to having spelling correction switched on when you're writing that after a while you forget what it actually is. So yeah, this kind of concludes things. The only thing I want to make sure you understand is that we can have different parameters as well. So I could write a function where I say value and unit, for example. So I have two input variables. The only thing I have to do is then in my function, I would have to, instead of using temperature.value, it would in this case just be value. And where I do something with the unit, it would just be unit. So that is equally valid. Will work just as well. But then when I call the function, it will not be this. It will be temperature value, and it will be temperature dot units. And that will also still work. So it's how you define this function, what the name is, what the parameters are, how many parameters and of what types, and what the return value is completely up to you. Yeah? The only restriction that you have, and sometimes it's an annoying one, is that you can have only one return value. Yeah? So I return a different temperature here. I can't return two different things. But of course, what I could do is I could return an object that has different things in there. And now my return value is an object, and I would have to give these things names. So I could say value is this, and I don't know, this doesn't make any sense anymore. The number is this, and my animal is this. Yeah? And I still only have one return value, an object, and result would now be that object. And when I write out my result, it writes out that object. So if you have to write a function where you return multiple things, then you can do it, but you will have to put them inside of an object somehow and then return that. Or you put them inside of an array and you return the array. That is also possible. The only rule in JavaScript is that you return one thing, whatever the thing is. Yeah, and returning all the special stuff in JavaScript is, of course, also legal. I can return not a number, or I could return infinite, or I could return undefined if there is an error, or if I want to make sure that I know that there is nothing, I can return null. All these things are allowed. Anything that is a variable is allowed, all the different types. But it can only be one thing. And actually, I could even do this. Yeah? So I'm returning a function now. But I'm not going to say anything more about that. We will talk about that when we talk about some of the more advanced stuff, if someone wants to go over that. Yeah? But the most logical, of course, in this case is that you say converted temperature. And then we go back to where we were. Okay, so that is, I think, when you look at the basic stuff, that is what I wanted to cover. And like I said, if you go online and you read about JavaScript, you will definitely see things in the syntax that we have not covered yet. Part of the reason for that is that I feel that some things are not used very often. JavaScript has a way to work with bits, for example, and do calculations with bit fields and so on. Sometimes it's useful, in most cases it's not, so I have not covered that. There are some types of loops that we have not covered. There is some advanced syntax that we have not covered for loops and arrays and objects. But those are things that you can look up, and I think the ones we've covered are the most interesting ones. The other reason that you might find something that is not in what I've told is that it is ES6. I've told you very, very little ES6. As I said in the beginning, let and const are ES6, will not work in Switch. And this loop that you see here is an exception that is also ES6, and it will not work in Switch. Most of the other stuff I would have to think, but I think almost everything. Well, we also saw the exponent, so power of operator, that is also ES6, but the rest of the stuff is simple JavaScript that will work in most environments where you will come across it. So this gives you a good basis for doing things.
In the last version of Switch, it will work with the Node.
If you use the Node.js part, yes.
So in Switch, they talk about legacy scripting now.
Yeah. That's not how I remember it. Yeah. I will ask the question in the Facebook group as well. The question is, we've done 5 classes now. I think this is the basis stuff. I will certainly give homework on this bit because now you have function and so on, so it becomes a little bit more interesting. There are some additional things that we could do. One of the suggestions would be to look at some of the more advanced ES6 stuff. We already had a question from Stefan a couple times, a couple classes ago, for example, to make a deep copy of an array or an object that is easy with ES6, but not with old style syntax necessarily. But there are some other things that are quite cool and that you will start running into when you start talking about, well, when you start using Node.js, for example. So that could be one class. The other class that I think would make sense is, if people are interested in that, is to show how you use this in Switch, the legacy scripting then. Yeah. Because of course, Switch uses JavaScript, but you have to also understand how it connects with the Switch environment. For PDF Toolbox, we've already done that in the past at some point. I'll have to see where that movie is and make sure that you have access to that as well. And then one other idea that I had was to assemble, to get together some examples. And I could come up with some, but I'm sure some of you could come up with questions, but real world examples. Like I have a file with a particular file name and I need to extract a job ID from that, for example, or I have a file name that follows a particular naming convention and I want to see which code would work with that naming convention and extract values from there. I can think of a number of those relatively simple examples where we could go over how you do that. And that might be useful to show you some of the common ways of dealing with things like that. Of course, that would be more interesting for everyone, I think, if you would also come up with some examples that you've run into or questions that that you have had. Yeah. Any questions about any of this stuff? Because my watch tells me I haven't walked very much today yet, so I have to go walk apparently. Good. So I will post the video again as usual. I will post it in Dropbox. You should have the link for Dropbox by now. If you don't, it's also on the Facebook page for the 4-Piece Cafe. If you don't find it there or you don't have Facebook, ask me. Just send me an email. I will do that. I will also post a question on who is interested in additional sessions, and we'll see what we can do in, on that side. But at least I hope when you now run across JavaScript, even with only these 5 classes, when you run across JavaScript scripts, that it should at least be a little bit more clear what happens in these things. In order to write it yourself, it's the same as learning a language, I'm afraid. You just have to use it. Yeah? There's no secret to learning a development language. You just have to use it and fail a lot. And then eventually you understand why you fail and things will get more interesting.
Do you know if there are any plans of making a Node package for PDF Toolbox?
I don't know.
Something for you to do instead of walking.
Yeah, I can't combine that. I don't know. We haven't looked at that. The question is whether it would have advantages, but I'm not at the point yet that that I know what would be the advantage of having a Node project for it.
Well, integration to other stuff, web pages and...
Yeah, but is that not more a feature of the switch flow that is behind it than the configurator that does it?
Well, maybe. Well, they sooner or later have to rewrite the configurator anyway.
Yes, that is true, and it would not be a bad idea to do it. I think there are some improvements that I know as well. So, yeah. But I'm definitely willing to do a session about this Node.js stuff as well within Switch. The only problem is I would probably have to learn a little bit as well before I can do something that makes sense for everyone. But I need to do that anyway, so that's not...
Yeah, there's a lot of the old legacy scripting that is removed. So you have to use packages instead.
Yeah, but that I actually like.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the legacy scripting, I don't know how to remain politically correct, but it kind of sucks. So, and there are better ways to do it by now. So,
weren't you part of that, David?
What? I didn't hear that, Christian. Yes, of course, but it was a long time ago. So if you don't evolve...
Oldies but goldies.
Hmm?
Oldies but goldies.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a thing if you have nested properties, then you have to do some special coding to get them all. Otherwise, the script will fail because it can't find the nested properties. So you have to have a lot of if and else checks to see if they are there or not, or used or not. So that's a trap you can run into. I've been there.
I'm not surprised. Okay, I hope so far people enjoyed it. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to go have a drink and then walk a bit and think about what homework we could come up with for this time. You have to show me a little bit more your homework that you make, because I have not had many reactions. So people are afraid of making it, I think, and you shouldn't be. Just make it, send it to me, and I will be very happy to tell you what was good and what was not good. You're going to learn much more from that than just watching this silly video.
I missed this. I made mine this morning, so I'm a bit behind. I will send it to you later.
It's not too late. It's not too late.
No.
If you join,
I'll send it after this.
Just send it to me. So david@4ps.com. If not everyone has my email address, just send it to me, and I will grade it.
I actually did mine during lunchtime, and then I got the answers from David. He slapped me, and that was great.
Yeah, and I didn't even say it was bad. So
no. you give useful advices to make it better. So that was great. Thanks.
Yeah. So look at the. If you haven't done it, don't be afraid. Look at the older video again. Do the challenge, and then send it in, and you will get some feedback. Good. Have a great rest of the day, everyone. And
Okay, bye-bye.
See you next time.
Thanks. Enjoy the drink and the walk. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.